public budgeting, which the word public we're probably all familiar with, but the idea of public versus private in an economic sense is public for the most part means government or government funded, whereas a private entity such as a private corporation like a Google or an Apple is owned by private individuals. So public budgeting is looking at governmental revenues and expenditures, and for the most part for governments they receive revenues from taxation and they spend on various things depending on what level of government you're referring to. In the basics, you can have one of three options in terms of what does the budget look like. The budget is either balanced, when you are spending exactly what you make, or revenues equal expenditures. There's a budget surplus, when your revenues exceed your expenditures, so you're keeping spending under control for the most part, or you're receiving lots of revenues. Or lastly, the budget deficit, when expenditures exceed revenues. And when a budget deficit occurs, just like any private individual, so for example, when you need money to go to college and you don't have it, so your revenues are X, but you're going to need to spend a lot more than that, then the government, just like you, has to borrow the money. And just like you, they borrow the money in the same market, which is the loanable funds market. So we'll eventually talk about the crowding out effect of expansionary fiscal policy when the government is deficit spending. Now the effects of a budget deficit, like the crowding out effect as I just stated, when government or any citizen spends more than they make, they need to borrow the money from the loanable funds market. That need to borrow is an increase in demand for loanable funds, which raises the price of loanable funds, also known as the real interest rate. This rise in interest rate causes borrowing to become more expensive and decreases consumption and investment spending, which is why it's called the crowding out effect, because as the public sector, government, is borrowing more money, driving up real interest rates, it means that private individuals like consumers and investment spending, business spending, is going to fall because they're going to react because they're sensitive to interest rates. So just going back to the basics, if we have tax revenues are 50 and government spends 100, what is the state of the budget? So revenues are 50, expenditures are 100. That would mean that the budget is in deficit to the tune of $50. Or their budget line is negative 50, as revenues are less than expenditures. Now, if you use some larger numbers, if tax revenues are $450 billion and the government is only spending $100 billion, what's the state? That would be in surplus to the tune of a positive $350 billion, just simply 450 minus 100 billion. Now, as we look at the government, the federal government budget over the last 40 or so odd years, with some projections as well beyond the current, the year, which this was in 2012. We can see that most are in the red, referring to a budget deficit, except for the end of the large expansionary period of the 1990s, seeing the end of the Clinton administration, the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, up until the War of 2001, or the wars of 2001. And as you can see, for the most part, we run large deficits through the 80s and the 90s. We have that expansionary period that ends with the Clinton and Bush administrations. Then we have the budget deficits during the major war years. Then we have the recession of 2008-2009 causing budget deficits to increase by a lot, and you can see those numbers of over $1 trillion in deficit per year. And then it's been lowering, and the projected is that it's going to go back up in the next 10 years from 2012. Now, the other piece that is different, so deficit refers to a budget line in 1 year. So the budget deficit in 2009, as you can see, is $1.48 trillion. But the debt is something that's different. It's the sum total of all of the deficits and surpluses and balanced budgets that we've had throughout the years. So the deficit in 2009 was $1.48 trillion, which added to the larger debt, which is the sum total, which is somewhere around $17 trillion or so now in 2016.